Hello again. Today I want to talk about and show some of my traction, trolleys, Interurbans collection, and in particular a freight motor which is coming up into view now. We'll have a better look at that later when I go around the layout. Now, a lot of people don't really know what Interurbans are outside of North America. And the best way I could describe it is that they are a halfway point between trolleys, or what we call trams in Europe, and railroads, mainline railroads. In many of the same reasons and ways that narrow gauge systems were used in Europe to reach areas that were less populated and so on, this was the function that the Interurbans served in North America. Now I'll give you an example of an interurban and that existed and how it actually worked. In Maine, in the northeast of the United States in New England, there was an interurban that ran between Portland, the largest city in the state and the main commercial center, and Lewiston, a city in the central of Maine, the central area of Maine. Now, these two cities were connected by two major railroads. Out on the east side along the coast ran the Grand Trunk Railroad, which ran up around Casco Bay on the coastal side of Portland and then all the way up into Canada. And on the other side of Maine, the inland side, was the Maine Central, and they both reached Lewiston by different directions. Now, there was a gap in between the lines going from the east, the Grand Trunk, and from the west side, the Maine Central. And there were towns and communities in between that were not served properly by rail. And this is where the Interurbans came in. And particularly if the cities on either end had a trolley network, which both Lewiston, Auburn, and Portland did. Lewiston and Auburn are two cities connected together in central Maine. This meant that the Interurbans could not only serve the countryside and the small towns and villages that were not served by the main railroads, but they could also get into the downtown areas of cities by using the existing trolley network. Now, if you were modeling Interurbans, it's the easiest thing in the world because basically it was a straight single track, most of them, and the catenary was little more than a creosoted pole at the side of the track with a bracket off it and a DC contact wire suspended from it. So the catenary is so easy and so basic. Some of these systems were serious, rail systems like the Pacific Electric in Southern California, which was a massive network, basically connecting Los Angeles to San Diego and all the communities and cities in between, places like Pasadena and so on, Hollywood, and there were large ones up around the Chicago region, and Interurbans were very common in the Midwest, not as much in the southern states. The thing is with the lines, like the one I described that ran between Portland and Lewiston in Maine, some of them were flashy affairs in terms of they had cars that could rival the Pullman cars of the mainline railroads, except they were smaller. And they basically died out, most of them. Some of them still exist, like the Chicago and South Bend, which runs out of Chicago into Indiana direction, and that ran some massive locomotives. The Big Joe locomotives that used to work for the Milwaukee Road ran on them. And that's still open to this day, and it's still basically what it was, more modern rolling commuter stock. Now, not only did these Interurbans carry passengers from downtown trolley services to downtown trolley services in other states, other cities, but they also carried freight. And this is what this is here. This is my interpretation of what they call a freight motor. Now, it was basically a baggage car, or what they call a combine. And where the Interurbans really were successful was in time-sensitive traffic. This would be things that were perishable goods that had to get there on the same day. So they'd be very useful for things like milk and dairy products, and also newspapers, things like that. Now, as you see, this is a converted coach that I dropped it down, and I have it running on a Bachmann GP40 chassis. It runs beautiful. I've created a pole, a pickup pole for the roof, for the pantograph, and basically they would pull up to a rural community, throw urns of milk in here, then throw out newspapers from the big cities like Portland, and then carry on the way delivering the milk. Now, some of them also, many of them were capable of hauling at least one boxcar. So those boxcars tend to be things that, like this, like you saw me in a recent video weathering and antiquing this model. Food again, quick things, perishables. And again, the main advantage, they got them downtown. So suppose you were shipping from Portland to Lewiston on the Grand Trunk. You'd have to bring the produce or whatever it is to the Grand Trunk depot or to the main central depot in Lewiston from Portland. It would either have to be collected by somebody or delivered to its final destination downtown via a truck or whatever, a car. The beauty of the Interurbans is they went right downtown on the trolley system, so they could literally stop outside a store and drop things out the side door into the customer. And they lasted until the end, until basically the Great Depression was the beginning of the end. Motor cars took over and motor buses became more popular, coaches and so on. But they're a fascinating thing to model because they all have their own unique identity. Now, this is a freelance freight motor, and it's pretty typical of what ran on these networks. And so, but it was very easy to kitbash and so on, and I created a new cab at the front, and job done. I have what we need. But there was also other interesting equipment that was used in line maintenance and so on. I want to show you some of them here. These kinds of things, they would kitbash real life kitbashing of old equipment and stuff in order to work on the railroad. And you would have things like cranes, recovery cranes now, but they would be very different than the ones on the main railroads because, well, I mean large size mainline railroads, they're often much smaller because they wouldn't be required to pick up something like a large steam locomotive if it crashed and so on, or derailed, if it derailed. On top of that, you had specialized cars that were really working on Interurbans, and this is an example here. This is called a pantograph car. Now, the pantograph car is a work car, basically, that picks up power from the pantograph on the roof. And in here, you would have all kinds of workshops and machinery. So the tools and the things needed to fix the railroad would be inside here. And it would also these would also be dormitory cars. So if they were out in the countryside somewhere and they had to sleep overnight, the crews could sleep in them. So they were cars with power on the roof. Interurbans in Europe, Europeans tended to go with narrow gauge lines, but I do think there's one and still in existence in Vienna in Austria, the Wiener Straßenbahn, which goes from the suburbs of Vienna out into the country and is still there to this day, and I think that would be close to one. But there wouldn't be many examples. You see what basically happened in countries where you'd want to fill out the lines between the main lines in Europe. You tended to go narrow gauge, which is why there were so many narrow gauge lines in Switzerland and Ireland and Belgium and places like that, northern France. So that's a freight motor. That's what a freight motor does. It delivers time-sensitive freight on an interurban line, and it's able to use the trolley system downtown. Some of them are strong, not all of them, some of them are strong enough in horsepower terms to pull a box. It used to be a very popular form of rail modelling in the US, in the older magazines, but it's not as popular today. And it's a shame, really, because it gives great opportunity for building quite a good layout on a small baseboard. So, for instance, if you had a small baseboard and like 6x4, even smaller maybe, you could build on one side of it a farming community with the interurbans running through that, and then on the other side an urban community, and then you could have it running on the trolley lines downtown. The catenary couldn't be easier. Forget about, you wouldn't have to invest in some kind of complex system like Sommerfeld, and they have tremendous charm. It's from a time in America around the time of Prohibition in the 20s and 30s. Interesting looking cars, cityscapes, townscapes, and so on. So we'll just let this freight motor deliver this time-sensitive traffic to somewhere in the rural areas between two urban trolley services.